Thank you, Tanya. Our first reader is Maureen Boyle, and Maureen lives in Belfast. Her third book and second full collection, The Last Spring of the World, was published by Arlen House in June this year. Her first collection, The Work of a Winter, was shortlisted for the Strong Shine Award. Her poem sequence, Strabane, with photos by her husband, Malachi O'Doherty, was published in 2020. So I'll invite Maureen up for us to read for us.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you to Tanya and to David for the invitation. It's lovely to be back in Bray. So I'm going to start with a prose piece that we put into the poem called Luscus. I'm just going to read you a section of it. The eyes are lined neatly in wooden trays. They are laid in grooves according to colour, and there seem to be hundreds of them, staring blind off velvet lining. The velvet is deep purple, as though they had been laid there bleeding, but that is a fantasy, and the velvet may be too. It was, after all, a National Health Clinic in the Royal Victoria Hospital in 1966, but my memory of it is blurred and mixed with winter darkness and the sense of a bazaar. My parents have taken me first to the giant Woolworths store in the centre of Belfast to buy a bright yellow rubber duck as beacon of small light in my hands, distraction from the ordeal ahead. And whether it was because this is my first remembered experience of looking out on the world with only half the light I'd had till then, all of that first trip to Belfast and to the clinic is shrouded in the colours of the dark, of rich mahogany wood, of the hunched Victorian corridors of the Children's Hospital, of shops with wooden counters and sweets in wood-cornered vats, like coloured fish you had to scoop out into little brown bags for weighing, of dark polished doors, and of rain. We are there to find me and I, and the man who would do this was Mr. Lennox. Apart from the trays of eyes, I remember little of that first visit, but I would come to know his method very well over the next 20 years, and would miss it when he finally retired. He would begin by washing his hands very thoroughly, and then he would simply sit and look into my one good eye, staring into it as if hoping to find a secret. The secret of its precise colour, of the size of the pupil, of the colour of its iris, the shades of white, the shape of the eye. And then the choosing would begin, and that is where the perfectly organised trays came into play. He would begin to scan the strange spectrum, leaving the tray of browns that had at one side a disconcerting row of pink albino eyes, and the trays of greens, and go instead to blue, the colour of my eyes and of my family's. He would gather up a range of them like a boy lifting coloured marbles and hold them one at a time, not initially where my empty socket was, but at the side of the good eye, the better to do the matching. And it seemed to me that the movement of his fingers, deftly moving the first eye chosen back into his palm and another forward between thumb and forefinger, was done like a conjuring trick. A version of the one where an uncle takes a coin from a child's nose or its ear. This kindly uncle was going to pluck me back an eye from his magic box of them. We are here because I've recently had an enucleation. My left eye removed entirely after an accident. The word comes from nuclear, which means kernel, the removing of the seed from the kernel, the eye thumbed out like a Brazil nut from its shell. I'll come to know these words too in the years and months ahead. The socket, like pocket, from which the eye has slipped, been picked. The sulcus from the furrow of a plough, for the little groove between eyelid and eyebrow. I remember nothing of the enucleation, but I do remember the day I lost my eye, an odd idea, as if I had been careless and left it somewhere or dropped it while playing. My parents were building an extension. It was the mid-60s when people built their own houses or did things to them, and we knew about plans and permissions. The builder was from Strabane. We lived outside the village of Sion Mills in County Tyrone, a mill village where my mother grew up, in a house on the Millmount Road in the townland of Liggertown. And my mother and father were replacing the tiny scullery, which would then become the back kitchen, with a big, light kitchen that would have a massive orange formica table around which we would all sit on high stools, and a divider of shelves made of exotic bamboo for ornaments. The sink would face the road, the main road between Derry and Omagh, and its big picture window would allow my mother to look out on the world as she did her chores, to see the buses passing at their regular times, and later the soldiers set up checkpoints on the corner, and beyond to the fields, the river, and the mountains. On this day, my sister, who is younger than me, is playing with me in the garden. There is a vast, uncultivated meadow behind where the vegetables grow. It is a country site, and too big for my father and grandfather to tend, where we like to play safaris, imagining ourselves lost in the jungle, when in fact we are hiding behind overgrown gooseberry plants and under the umbrella leaves of the wild rhubarb. But it begins to rain, and so we take shelter in the garage, which contains the overspill of the family house and good things to play with. In later years, though I doubt it was ever said, I always saw what happened subsequently as carrying a moral message. Always do what you're told. My mother having called us in out of the rain, meaning come into the safety of the house. Instead, we go to the garage where we're not really supposed to play because of my father's tools and garden wheel killers. But I love the smell of creosote and the jam jars my father screws by their lids to shelves to hold all his different nails and twine. We are playing with umbrellas in there. My parents have a print of Renoir's Le Parapluie de Cherbourg in our living room. Its colours all the greys and blues of Parisian rain. The woman in the front of the picture, which looks dry, carries an empty basket lined dark like a gaping hole. A little girl stands by with a hoop. The rain of this day is green in my mind and rust-coloured from the gravel of the drive as it runs down the slight slope from the garage, running down the fields in front of the house, down into the Mourne River. But we are dry inside the garage, and rain is spectacle through the open doors. Like the moment in White Christmas, where the barn doors are suddenly opened behind, so that the scenery is suddenly real. There is an old white umbrella, which I think may have been from my mother's wedding. It has a frill and it seems sumptuous, and it too is forbidden for play because of the dangers of its tip. And that day also, in the garage, is the builder's equipment stored there for the weekend. There is a stepladder. My little sister climbs to the top. I am underneath, looking directly up at her. There is a trowel from the old French word trowel, a small tool for spreading plaster or mortar, from the late Latin truella, small ladle, dipper, a stirring spoon, a ladle, a skimmer. Thank you. I'm going to read part of a sequence called Bypass, which was written about the fact that at one stage in the north, because of shortages, the NHS was sending people to Hammersmith to have heart operations, and my father was one of these. And this is about our experience. Bypass. In the middle of that winter, we fly together for the first time, my mother, you, and I, the three of us retracing your honeymoon journey. Then you had just left your wedding breakfast in the Windmill Cafe in Strabane, and she would tease you for years about how, all the way to London, you discussed hens, the best layers and eaters, with a man selling them in the north. A sign, she said, of your lack of romance, or perhaps just a need to be distracted from what lay ahead. Now we use the little bottles of Bloody Mary and crackers as distraction from what you face, having your heart taken out as we will ours, our hearts going out to you. The waiting is erotic, the young doctor full of sex as he checks you in and tells you there is a mortal risk of death. We hear this from his lips, but my mother says it is no odds, we have no choice, and I am party to what have been intimate and private talks. We leave you in your room, knowing you must deal with the night, worrying that you should have your milk, that the ordinary rituals be preserved. We sleep in the nurses' quarters facing the jail, beside a family from Cyprus whose father is also on the ward. They have no English, we no Greek, but we find comfort in each other all the same. In the morning, we return as they prep you, and a bitter sister from Sligo jokes at the question that asks if you have any tattoos. I want to hit her. That afternoon, as we leave you, the young Caribbean orderly who takes you to theatre is the first to be gentle, telling us and you'll be okay. We walk back along a corridor of blue dolphins, incongruously gay, but the paint is faded and lends a dragging weight to our sense of wading dazed and weary through a dark subterranean world. We are told to go and pass the time somehow. The Belfast sisters of another man like the joke that they will go to the theatre while he is in theatre. We silently applaud them, even if we're not ready to laugh yet. We take the bus into the city. It is full of prisoners' wives back from visiting the scrubs. We think of my grandmother, who worked for the post office in London during the First World War and visited IRA men there. And now you, the son who will come in the next chapter of her life, lie in the shadows of its dark walls. Away from the hospital, we feel our senses heightened, the petrol smells of traffic, the primary colours of the buses and the Café Rouge, early Christmas lights and music, the shunting of trains and sirens, the chatter of children. It is Friday. We see men gathered outside mosques. A Somali mother holds her child in a window. An older Greek woman incenses her door. I bring my mother to St. Charles in the Little Vatican to pray in its quiet shell-pink chapel, the college in St. Charles Square where I learned to be a teacher. They say you meet your other selves when you return to a place like this, and I think of all the Fridays and the good tiredness that comes with the ending of a week with students and how that younger self could not have imagined this. Then to Westminster and more prayers. From the window of Pizza Express, we watch the Christmas shoppers, envying them the ordinariness of their day, read of the sinking of Venice, remember it is the one place my mother would like to see, stare intently into the red carnations on our table till we can put off returning no longer. When we come back, you are out of theatre, raised high on an icy bed, a ventilator breathing for you. Your doctor tells us they have taken 3 ways past your heart, but some is so diseased you will not live a long time, but maybe better. On the day you should be going home, infection, temperature, and a return to theatre. Her name is Pearl. She is from St. Lucia. She is maybe the 100th nurse you've seen. She is efficient and kind. She calls you Mr. Boyle. Pearl is to remove a line from your neck. You are so pierced that there is danger. I take your hand and wonder how many years since we held hands and how the last ever day of childhood goes unremarked, unnoticed. There must have been a day when you held my hand for the last time. Now I hold yours and Pearl says, just look at your daughter's face. On a very bad day, we are sitting with my aunts in the canteen. They have flown over and I am flying home. We are all feeling lost. My youngest brother looks at them and says, If Granny had stayed here, we might all be English. When I return, I leave my red leather gloves on the grey seat of a black cab. My mother meets me and says, "Your father is just trying to live." She keeps vigil, bringing you porridge that the Caribbean women sprinkle with cinnamon for a little spice. The nurses teach her to disinfect the lines with antiseptic to keep the infection at bay. And sometimes it seems you are being crucified there in the bed before us, and we are praying just that it should be over. But this is not the time to die. And just before Christmas, we bring you home a fragile parcel, wondering how it would be possible for you to travel. But it is done somehow, and you are so pleased to be alive, to have a cup of tea, to sleep again in your own bed. Thank you. And my father lived, I think, in about 5 years after that. And this is a wee poem from after he died. It's called So Lightly Here and takes its epigraph from Leonard Cohen. So come, my friends, be not afraid. We are so lightly here. At Kilmainham, Leonard Cohen's face, enlarged on the screen, becomes yours in your thin, aged frailty, singing over us in the pale, early summer sky. Later, I wonder how it was for you that night. My mother says you spoke of flowers and stumbled to the bathroom. What is it like to wake for the last time? Did you know that your heart was going to stop? And for days when I'm alone, I pick up the phone saying, "Daddy," in all the tones I'll never need again, as if the redundant word could reach you, could travel down the dead line. This poem is called Meeting My Granda on Google. And this is a Granda who I never knew, but eventually found in the 1911 census. In one of those evenings of searching, somehow by a route I don't know how to repeat, I land up in the room of a little house in Donegal, West Donegal to be precise, in the Poor Law Union of Glenties, in the division of Dairos, in the barony of Boyle, in the parish of Inishkeel, in the townland of Nairn, at the house of neighbourer Peter McClune and his wife Rose and their 3 children, Annie Marie, Evelyn, baby Patrick, and you. We missed each other in the real world, passing on the road. But here I can peek in the window to the kitchen and the fire and the filling out of the census form when you are 25 years old and boarding here on a painting job. You'd have taken the train from Strabane to Glenties across the Finn Valley with the lake full of wind and reeds, your bike in the luggage car with your letters, or would you have borrowed these? I can picture the road from Glenties to Portneuf, its great sweep around the bay that is scenery for us and work for you. You painted big commissions, schools, hospitals, and something had hurt you. What I learned were stories of you coming home, going straight to the pub to toast the town, while my granny, 7 daughters, and my father waited at home. He would be put to sleep with you on nights when you were drunk and railed in the bed, so that for all his life in nightmare, he was a terrified boy again. But for now, I like to think you are happy, that there is tea for the enumerator, even dinner perhaps, and singing after with a cup of porter or a bit of poaching. One story tells of how near Downings you went across the bay to a pub by boat and hadn't returned next morning, the villagers going to the beach to look for you. And just as panic started to rise out of the glistening distance, your big voice singing "The West's Awake" comes across the surface of the sea. You lived long enough to see my father marry. In the year you died, my parents lost their first baby named for you, my father losing his father and his first son in the same year. That little house is the light from a dead star, reaching all the way here, you singing by the fire. And I'll just finish with a poem called Sidnus. This is from one of Plutarch's stories that he based Antony and Cleopatra on, but this is a story that he didn't use, and I thought it was so intriguing. So it's called Sidnus. Plutarch says that when Antony arrived to feast with Cleopatra, he was dazzled by an array of lights he had never seen before, hung from the top of her house in every colour and shape imaginable. She had curated a set on which to shine, where darkness was banished and light was somehow got in every place, devices so artificially set that this seasoned soldier who had eaten berries from the winter trees and supped the stagnant water of puddles was bewitched and speechless. What was so different here from the grand houses of Rome he was used to? What tricks of mirrors and of floating wicks, what burning alabaster made a sanctuary of the place and lit the ceiling like a literal sky swept with stars. He craned his neck to gaze upon it, even as his feet sank into the depths of Paestum roses. And she performed her magic trick of taking the orb of pearl from her ear, a full moon held between her fingers and dropped into a goblet to announce an eclipse and the coming of the dark. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maureen. That was really wonderful. I really enjoyed listening to those poems, and obviously the prose piece as well at the start. Our next reader is Stephanie Conn, and Stephanie is the author of Copeland's Daughter from Smith Doorstep, and also The Woman on the Other Side, Island, and Off Kilter, which are all published by Dura Press. Stephanie's prizes include the Seamus Heaney Award for New Writing. She will be one of the 2023 resident artists at the Cultural Centre Irlandais in Paris. Stephanie, so if you could read for us, please.
Thank you, Brian. Like Maureen said, it's lovely to be back again. I was here the first year of Bray Festival, and it's lovely to get the warm welcome. So I'm reading from Off Kilter, and I'm going to start with a poem that brings together a few of the collection's key themes, the body and the environment under pressure and transformation. An African forest elephant approaches. 1. When she finally arrives, there's no denying her. Even this smaller forest kind is one of the largest mammals on earth. Other creatures keep their distance, know if they are to eat, they must target the calf, risk the mother's pointed rage. Keystone species, uprooting trees, scrub, turning the savanna to grassland. In drought, they dig, make water holes. I creep with all the forest animals, rest my bare knees on dusty ground, slake my thirst. My thinning face reflects sunken eyes. The corners of my mouth twitch. When I pull back the upper lip, my incisors are growing into tusks. 2. Now I keep close to water, protect skin with mud and dust, walk, don't trot, gallop or jump, eat for 3/4 of the day, wrinkles retain water, keep me cool. I let my pillar legs take the weight, communicate through seismic signals, detect vibration in the bones. So this collection is informed by the lived experience of chronic illness, and one of the sections is my own experience of that. And of course, for anyone who knows, when you get sick, you tend to think it's something minor and it'll pass very quickly. Dizzy spell. To momentarily lose your balance on the way to the bathroom late at night is not that unusual. Just drunk on sleep, staggering naked along the landing, the walls close enough to keep you upright. And headaches are common things, though they throb drowning drum beats in your skull, make teeth ache. If I close my eyes in a blacked out room and keep my weighted body flat, head sunk in a breath-stale pillow, this too will pass. If I swallow the yellow pill 4 hourly, ignore the pinprick smarting of my skin, I'll step from the bed when a week has passed, won't crumple, all feeling gone, to the floor. So my own experience, I had many investigations for about a year and was finally diagnosed with fibromyalgia, which is very poorly understood and still contested. So whenever you're in hospital, you very quickly realise how much the body is objectified, or how much you as a person are objectified, and become just the body. Cross-section with contrast. They are scanning the inside of my body. Abdominal cavity, blood vessels, bones. Iodine pulses through my veins, flushes warm and wet between my legs. I've been forewarned, assured I will not piss myself. A man with kind eyes squeezes my hand twice, then steps behind a screen. I wonder if it's bulletproof. I'm on my back, stripped of my wedding ring, the necklace from my daughters. They hold no traction here, in this room of machines that ignore the heart in favour of the stiller organs. So when you're faced with a condition that you know very little about, and indeed the medical profession know very little about, you get all sorts of contradictory information. So this short poem is a nod to that. Attending to the wound. 1. Lick the wound. Licking a wound can promote healing. Let the saliva coat the skin. Its natural antibacterial agents will do it the world of good. 2. Do not lick the wound. Licking a wound is unsafe. Saliva contains a variety of bacteria. The wound could become infected. Amputation may be required. So I was very clear when I was researching and writing this book that I wanted it to move beyond just the personal experience of chronic illness, and I looked at other creatives who lived with it and who inspired their work. So there's a section in the book about Frida Kahlo, the Mexican artist who lived with pain most of her life. She had a horrific accident in early adulthood, and the first poem is about that. Mexico City Tracks. I knew all about the black funeral trams carrying 90% of the city's deceased to the cemetery, and ancient human sacrifices stretched over stone, so the priest could rip out the heart, cut off the head, fling what remained of the dead down the pyramid steps. I was thinking of neither when the tram flung me forward, crushed me completely. I was longing for my coloured bolero, the shining box of it, how it opened at the chest, and as metal pierced my flesh like a panther's tooth, cut between my legs, I saw only bright shades, red, violet, gold. Broken from the inside out, spinal cord, collarbone, pelvis, ribs, robbed of my virginity by an iron rod, I should have died. They sewed me back together on a folding table. I should have died. I lived, and as my head was still intact, they placed a mirror above so I could feast on my face. And that, of course, was the beginning of her painting her very famous portraits, which gave her some control over what she was presenting to the world, and the next poem deals a little bit with that. She already had experience of illness. She had polio when she was a young girl, and as she was recovering, her father allowed her to do all sorts of very unladylike things as she tried to get her strength back. Pata de Pello. At 6 years old, pull 4 socks up the shin of the thin leg they wash in walnut water, rub gently with small hot towels. Father, grown tender, tells you run, skate, box, swim, kick. You cycle like a demon child round the park, row Chapultepec Lake, flash black bloomers climbing trees, hurl curses when they call you peg leg. At 26, perfect the swish and swirl of flowing A-line skirts, trimmed with pleated lace. Clutter your neck with starched frills, silk ribbons. Sling jade and fire opals from gold chains. Gather your hair in dark flamboyant knots, braid in place with clips and orchid blooms. Present a bold stare that dares any living soul to look away, or look lower, deeper, to see the withered leg, the limp, the back brace reinforced with metal bars, leather straps, plaster casts, your moulded second skin. Kahlo was married to the artist Diego Rivera, and they had a very tumultuous relationship. So this is towards the end of Kahlo's life. Under a gangrene sun. They are coming for my foot. Will cut the leg beneath the knee to stop the pain, stop the poison spreading. They've been shooting Demerol into my arm for months to make the screaming stop, stabbing deeper into collapsed veins. My brow softens. Diego lifts his gaze at last to meet my woozy stare, and a fire star falls to earth, melts into green leaves on the ward floor, before it turns to desert sand. Everything is rotten and shifts in a canopy of thorns. Toes swing on stripped branches, hang from beaks. I hold my peacock ring in my left hand, a clay deer in my right. Try to remember who brought them, if it was you sobbing by my bed. You weren't so sentimental when my heart shattered, yet you blub for my poor dead foot. Birth red turned to brown, black, then blacker still. I love you most of all. You give me wings, and I've never needed them more than today, putting on my Tawana dress to meet the knife. So I'm going to finish with 2 from a section set in Tasmania. The landscapes in this book deal with climate change and environments very much under pressure. So the first one looks at bushfires. So I was in Tasmania in 2013 and actually witnessed the beginning of what turned out to be really, really horrific bushfires. Bushfire. There is one road in and out, mountain to sea and back again. We take it while we still can, trail the steady line of traffic climbing towards a choked sky. Streams only travel in one direction or dry up in heat waves such as this. The temperatures are still rising. Last night, as the children slept, we watched light streak across the sky, illuminating our shack on the hill. The back steps built close enough to jagged shrubs and grass. This morning we packed everything and left, shoved pink flip-flops and beach balls into the boot, headed north. We saw flames above the trees. By nightfall that road was blistered, nothing but a scorched, leaf-littered underpass, a net for fiery embers and sparks. Burning strips of eucalypt bark leapt from one side of the Black Lake to the other. We watched the news, recognise place names on digital maps not meant for tourists. We walked those beaches, where huge groups gather now, waiting for the ferocious fires to burn themselves out, return again to ash-dusted patches of land. At that time, one of the photographs that went viral around the world was of a grandmother under a jetty with her 5 grandchildren. I'll finish with this one. Bargaining. When life comes down to a headspace of air beneath the jetty, the atmosphere toxic, and above swirling tornadoes of fire, the house burning down to the ground, trees glowing scarlet in the haze, hissing, spitting out sparks, and a fireball sun beaming yellow, eucalypts exploding under a Mercurian orange-streaked sky. You cling to wood, cling to your grandchildren. Let the youngest lock fingers around your neck, her blonde curls bobbing on the cold surface, her eyes wide, lips a thin pale line. You wonder where their mother is, if she's praying. Check for 5 heads above water. Make your case. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. That was really powerful stuff. Really enjoyed that. Our third reader and final reader today is Glen Wilson. And Glen is a multi-award-winning poet from Portadown. He won the Seamus Heaney Award for New Writing in 2017, the Jonathan Swift Creative Writing Award in 2018, the Trim Poetry Competition in 2019, and the Pádraic Fallon Competition and Slipstream Open Poetry Competition in 2021. His poetry collection and experience on the tongue is available also from Dora Press. So Glen, if you can please read for us.
Thank you very much for the committee for having me down and the warm welcome I've had. It's amazing to be here. First sort of in-person reading for quite a while. I'm going to start with a poem called Once Upon a Time. Once upon a time, nestled in the back seat of a maroon Lada estate, wrapped in a king-size quilt, my brother and I stared out the windows and sketched our breaths on the cold, damp glass. We drew dragons fighting knights with out-of-proportion swords, scenes that would never resolve. Boys, go to sleep, Mum said, as she tried to fight the weight pushing down her own eyelids. We waited parked up on the curb as Dad said goodnight to his friend, huddled in a squat concrete tower, and as a family we set off, stealing prohibited moments along abandoned Armagh roads. I tried to listen in as my parents shared the contents of their day in hushed conversation. Bomb scare in Woodhouse Street, a break-in at Castle Hardware, Fletcher rang in sick again, nothing out of the ordinary. The town zips past and quickly turned pages, as the moon and stars seem to remain slow to change and motion. Then the trees come reaching out in truncated tragedy, held by their stoic boughs and relentless roots. I look at my brother, who is already over, mouth gaping open for dreams to take full command with their gossamer grip. I don't remember being carried back into the house, only waking amongst Paddington Bear wallpaper. This next one is a fictional family based on my own family. I was originally born in Oma, and it's basically 3 generations. It's called A Line of Hawthorns. 1. Peter John, autumn 1998, New Forge College. I break the spine in each page the turning over of soil, new descriptions and terms for movement of a second nature, relearning ridge and furrow in black and white. I measure pH balances, soil composition, then picture sods of grass that the tractor spins up from my father's lower fallow field. I know which earth crumbles, which holds its shape. I see my father getting down from the tractor cab, his eye, his plumb line as he charts the angle, adjusts the tread as if to say, we'll start here. Years have refined and exaggerated the process, but the action is still the ploughshare following the coulter. This next one, it's based on the sort of the practice of the foot binding that went on in China. And it was really just the terminology, the title of it, so the Lotus Gate, was the particular way that this gate that they created in the children that when they had this process done. I was particularly pointed when I was writing this one because it was just at the age where my daughter was when I was sort of looking at this subject and writing the poem. So it just really struck home with me. It's called The Lotus Gate. Mother is in the kitchen pretending to cook dinner. I can hear her flat feet shuffling on the cold earth. See her shadow flit at the bottom of the door. I bite my lip. Grandmother sits outside, rocking my brother to sleep. He hasn't slept the night fully through yet. Sometimes to calm him, I let him suck my finger. My aunt holds up a pair of lotus shoes, embroidered with peacock feathers, a gift from my betrothed, the youngest son of a great Han family from the city. She does an elegant turn, shows me how one day I too can walk like her, swaying towards balance, bending the knee to make such small steps. She hands me a rolled cloth to bite down on, steadies herself as each bone snaps. The last thing I see before I pass out is my toes curling into my soul. I wake, and she is there, tightening a bandage soaked in goat blood and herbs over my feet, covering all the purpling skin in deft figure eights. I'm told the emperor was so entranced by his beloved's elegant dance in white silken feet, all the other courtesans ran to copy her, seeking advancement, slowing their stride. This next poem is based sort of on in the First World War, where factories were all staffed sort of mainly by women and getting munitions processed, and it's called The Bridesmaids of Passchendaele. When Helen is leading the shift, the conversation is reserved, but Kate encourages the body song, so we canaries sing as the steel pineapples move. We share a lot of the "did you hear about so-and-so?" laughter, and then silences. Mock admonishments percolate the relentless rolling clatter. Amy, Sarah and I were in the same class at school just last year. All but 2 of the boys in that room went to the front. 7 have already returned. Last month, Sybil was blinded by a Mills bomb, wired all wrong. I watched her sight bleed into her palm. She came back months later, unlike Agnes. I can still see her shoes poking out from under that blanket. A thick khaki blanket veiled her body as crimson wept from where her head used to be. Judy Smith works steadily at the end of the line, quiet with thoughts of the battles to win when her war has already been lost. Amy talks endlessly about her gym heading off, catches herself off the edge of the workbench. She rubs her rib-pronounced belly. Jaundiced eyes stream out at closing time, hurrying back past the streetlights, signal fires sporadic in their return each day. Amy picks a rose as we walk to the bus stop, slips it into my yellow blouse to cover up the acrid scent of copper and add a splash of welcome red. Sarah's boots catch in the mud of the ditch. It takes all of us to hoist her out. Laughing, we link arms, march towards the approaching omnibus. This next poem came about, I used to work up in Castle Street in Belfast, so I was just used to the sights and sounds of everything that went on there, the tourist buses and everything that went on there, and it's called The Mouth of the Ford. The tour bus rumbles down Castle Street. The ground beneath us calls out in the tongue of the Farset River, stammered by stone. High Street paved over the forgotten quaysides, where the merchants first traded the city's name, the world in reach on the stretching sea. The Albert clock is stabilised now, but still slightly off a clear vertical, built on reclaimed land, listing from the measurable truth 1 foot at a time. Bridges are thrown up one on top of another, each generation's ante-seen in the engineering, the reuse of materials to join the unmoving banks. Samson and Goliath hang questions in the air, in a conversation stalled in awe. The refrain is that of the sweat-riveted dock days, sending the world the leviathans of their labours. Oceanic, Britannic, Celtic, this is a city known by its balancing act on ever-moving currents. This next poem is one I'm working on a new collection. It's based on Sir Robert Hart, who was Inspector General of the China's Imperial Maritime Customs Service, 1863 to 1911. Notable because he was born in Portadown, but spent most of his life living in China. But when I was studying him, I came across essentially, this must have been a press release for him, because basically everything he did was amazing, which wasn't true. And then I was able to find more sort of critical work, so I've tried to sort of combine those two things from this viewpoint. This one's called Hart's Diary. Hart's Diary, after the Boxer Rebellion. This door was on a single hinge, splinters fresh where the lock had been. Glass lay as angular pawns, rationing the light. A wind whispered out and in. The desk was overturned, a porcelain shepherd gifted to me, lolls headless and hollow at my scuffed feet. The secret drawer, for all its confidence, was crudely empty. I've been travelling longer than I've been home, trekked my Ulster temperament through these eastern tongues on board many fan-plumed yunks, felt every bump of every rickshaw in Peking, watched firedrake kites twist in the air. I've known the push and pull of duty, kinking from a wife to a concubine. Who would think these thoughts again? Much of what was said is forgotten, so all of what is thought is barely sketched. Which regret is more bitter to the self, the said or the unsaid, the deed done or the undone? Between the hagiography and the expose figurates the truth, and I'm as reliable as any other in its handling. The best guess is a child's mosaic to the master's stained glass. As I move charred furniture back into place, a crane looks in through the jagged gap before flying away at my movement. Its wings, feathering chapters, shedding appendices. And I'll just finish with one more here. And this one's called Angel Share. Angel Share. I love the sound of the column stills, always have. I started in the distillery on the 1st of July. Everything outside honey-soaked, the grass singed yellow. An apprentice to dark rooms, my nerves quieted by the comfort of low flames, where fermented grain mash burned in charred white oak casks, a magic tamed. The scent never changed, though they measured the spirit by decimal points instead of rule of thumb. I see those first coopers like vapours bending metal hoops to embrace the wood, handling configurations into armistice, so it matures enough to be poured out gold. Whiskey, a Gaelic word for water anglicised, sits on the lips, roughs the throat smooth. Against the grain of ancient casks hauled from the mouths of Spanish shipwrecks, this taut hand to slack hand journey mellows the fluid to a palatable proof, distills it to a single sip, a sensation. That is what I am, what we all are, an experience on the tongue, casting off from the world, hoping the taste gilt-edged, worth gifting on. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Glen. That was really good. That last poem is just so powerful, I think. I really love it. We have a little bit of time, I think, to have just a brief chat, maybe. I thought I'd start with just the idea of place, because you're billed as the Northern Voices, and I just wonder how Northern are you, or how much attached to place. And maybe it's obvious for you, Maureen. Well, I'll start with you, maybe to get your comments.
Yeah, I didn't read any of the Strabane poem, but a big part of the book is a sequence about the town that was close to the village where I grew up, and I think it is very important to me, partly because Strabane is often, when it's talked about, it's a kind of a joke in a way, because of the difficulties that it's had. It's always had terrible unemployment, and it always was quoted during the Troubles as the worst unemployment rate in Europe and the most bombed town in the north. There always seemed to be these awful superlatives, and I suppose I wanted to give a different picture. I think that's what poetry can do. It can kind of complicate things in a good way. And because we still go back there, my mother still lives there, it's a very beautiful place. And so I wanted to give a sense of the history, the fact that those difficulties actually go back hundreds, maybe thousands of years. It's always been a focal point of territorial war and of flooding and all kinds of problems. So yeah, it was very important. And also because I grew up in Sign Mills, which was a village modelled on a model English village by the mill owners. So my identity is complex in that sense. My father played cricket. We were a Catholic family, but he loved classical music. He wouldn't have missed the last night of the proms. We all sang Rule Britannia in Sion Mills, in the north, in a Catholic household. And in some ways, those complications are things that sometimes don't make their way into the discourse, So poetry is a good way of giving those other pictures, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. And I think everyone's family is much more complicated than we let on, and things go on that maybe, you wouldn't really admit to maybe later as well. But I think anyone who reads Strabane, I think it will change their mind about the town, even if they've never been there but only heard about it. Stephanie, I know in Off Kilter, you're not so much rooted in place as you were in your earlier collection, say in Ireland particularly, but maybe you might talk a bit about, how place informs your writing.
Yes, it has shifted with each collection actually quite a bit. The first collection is set all over the place, so there are poems set in Holland, Russia, Australia, and a lot of it is about actually being elsewhere and the difficulties of that. And yes, the second one then, Island, was about a very small island off the North Down coast, where my ancestors lived, and it's not inhabited anymore, so it was very much grounded in place. It was more about what place could say about the subject. In this case, it was chronic illness. So in this, just as the body's under pressure, the land is under pressure. So we have forest fires, we have seasonal disorder and so on. The land is very rarely trustworthy in this, and there's a lot of the unknown. We can't trust the ground that's there. So it has shifted, and I like that. I like the fact that I don't really know where I'm going with each new thing. It keeps me interested as much as hopefully then the reader.
That makes perfect sense. And when you read the collections, you can see that shift, I think. And Glen, in your collection, I mean, again, it's a very wide-ranging collection as well, but it's definitely grounded, I think, in place. Although you do move historically around, in terms of time a lot. So maybe just talk about how you approached place in the...
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that, especially the place of your childhood, is so formative in terms of your own formation, and it's almost like that's where you reset to go on to what you're doing. Anything else, if you sort of measure everywhere else by where you grew up, for better or worse, there's poems in that where I start. That's where the poem, it starts off with "Once upon a time, it's me in Armagh." It's a lot of sort of jumping about in time and different voices, which I actually quite enjoy. That it's no one wants 40 poems of a civil servant typing away at his desk, really. So I always just the idea of adopting different voices allows me to go to different places and look at things from a real fresh angle. So whilst my own sort of inner sort of eyes and formation is sort of based, I sort of know where I come from. I also am excited just to go elsewhere and learn what other places I can, and that's basically what the collection is. It's me starting off and then going and sort of coming back again with the new experiences being taken on board.
Just can I stay with you, Glen, just for a second, because you mentioned to me that the new poems or the new collection you're working on is more grounded in place in Portadown. So is that something you're consciously trying to do?
Yeah, the new collection that I'm sort of working towards is based around the history of Portadown. I'm looking to sort of especially with this, I find that it jumped around a lot, and I've sort of thought, no, I want to have something that is a wee bit more of a focus and a very cohesive theme, and so that framework of the sort of history of Portadown gave me sort of thinking, well, that still gives me a lot of freedom to work around different voices, but very much in one place. And I was looking for the variety within that with the new collection, hopefully.
That's great, thanks. And Stephanie, just, Glen was talking about, adopting voices and that, and you read the couple of Frida Kahlo poems there, for instance, and in earlier collections you've also written a lot of ekphrastic poems and things like that. So is that something you consciously seek to do, to kind of get a different perspective?
I think it's a wonderful break from looking at the self, especially I have been ill from I wrote all of the books, and I actively avoided the subject, and poetry was very much an escape actually from the reality of that. And when it got to the point of sort of looking at it face on, as I said, I didn't want the whole collection to be about my own experiences. I also wanted a break from mining that very personal material. So looking at the like of Kahlo, looking at different landscapes and so on allowed me to take a break from that, because sometimes that was quite tough to do. In saying that, taking on the like of voice of Kahlo can be tricky too, not everyone approves of that. And actually many poems have been written about Kahlo, and initially I thought I'm not going to go there. But when you're talking about art and pain, and the material is so rich, I just couldn't let it go. And I thought, okay, maybe I'll have one or two poems, and there's a whole section in the book. So it allowed me to be distracted from the personal, I suppose. And those poems have been, have been taken very well. As you say, it's somewhere different. It's different culturally. It's, the aesthetic as well. So yeah, an escape from the personal.
Yeah, and it definitely adds another layer to the collection, I think, as a whole. So it's successful that way as well. And just speaking of sources, a poem of yours, Maureen, that I want to mention is the Nunwell Letter, which is a really, really interesting poem, just as an idea, but the execution of it is great also. Maybe you can just give a little bit of background to the people about how you wrote the poem or where it came out of.
The Nunwell Letter is based on John Donne's wife, Anne Moore. I'd been teaching Donne for years and became very interested in her because despite the fact that biography suggests that she was his intellectual equal, she was classically educated, which was unusual. He lost everything by marrying her. He was on this trajectory through Elizabeth's government to be this shining star, and everything was lost. He was jailed, he lost his employment, they lived in poverty for years. But she's a blank in the record. There is no portrait of her, there are no letters of hers. And his famous poem, Valediction, Forbidding Mourning, which is so beautiful, but I discovered that we think that it was given to her to kind of calm her down when she was really annoyed that he was leaving for Europe, which in those days, we're talking about the early 17th century, so she was going to lose him for probably a year, but he had to go because he needed work. She was in her 8th pregnancy. She went to live with a sister who'd married well on the Isle of Wight, and while there lost a baby. So I got a scholarship from the Ireland Chair of Poetry to go to the Isle of Wight, and amazingly found the house is still extant. I wasn't allowed to see the part of it that was from the Stuart period when she would have been there, but I could see the Georgian and the Victorian extensions, and I could look into the older part. And basically the baby was buried in Brading on the Isle of Wight. So what I've done then is imagined Anne writing to Donn, because we know that he didn't hear until months afterwards, telling him about the loss of the child. And it's a kind of an answer poem to Valediction, so it uses a lot of the imagery from that, you know.
Yeah, and it's a really successful sort of close to the collection, I think, as well. I can open it up to the floor, but I think we have a minute or two, really, if anybody has any questions that they want to ask.
Were you always interested in writing, or what was it that hooked you for all of you?
I've always been an avid reader, and from early age, very much I find things easier writing them down in terms of just my own thoughts and just short stories and stuff like that. There, so I think it's something that comes naturally to me in terms of I would probably prefer that to, any sort of other big crowds or anything else. I find that I like the time to think through the thing. And I think that's sort of why I quite like the poems. They sort of have a meditative quality about them, that you can sort of take your time and consider the subject you're thinking on.
Yeah, so I came to writing late. I always read, I always did English right through school and into university, but I actually found poetry really difficult and something that for the most part I couldn't relate to. And it was when I was at university, my mother died after 10 years of being ill from cancer, and it was during that period of grief that I then turned to poetry and found that it was suddenly relevant and that I could take comfort from that. And really it was after that I started dabbling myself, and again it was about just trying to make sense of what was going on in my head and in the world. And that dabbling lasted about 10 years, so I was well into my 20s before I started to take it. I had a young family, so I didn't have time, so I was well into my 20s before I started writing in a more serious way, and now I am well and truly hooked.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote as a child. I've got wee poems that I found from when I was 7 or 8, and when I look at them, I can't imagine why I knew that was a poem so early, but I did somehow. And then I studied English as well. I was writing really hectically and frantically as a teenager, and I gathered up everything I had when I was about 18 and entered a competition that UNESCO ran for the Year of the Children in 1979 and won it. And that was just with all the little poems that I'd written, but I'd put them together in a wee book and was asked to Stormont to receive this medal. And that was quite a strange thing, again, for a Catholic family to go to Stormont. But it was a local broadcaster, Harry Barton, who was presenting me with this. And when he gave it to me, he said, "Your poetry reminds me of Helen Waddell." Of course, I had no idea at that age who Helen Waddell was. It took me years to go back and find her. When I eventually did, I found all kinds of commonalities. It was a really perceptive thing that he'd said. She's become a really touchstone figure for me. She was a Presbyterian, the daughter of missionaries, who went on to be a classical scholar in Cambridge. Anyway, then I went to Trinity, and like many people, studying English just killed the writing for a long, long time. I attempted a PhD in London and abandoned that. And it took me a long time to figure out what form I was going to write in, so I had tried and other things, and then came back to it when I was in my 40s, did the Masters in Queen's. And actually then I've ended up with a slightly hybrid form, I think, is quite narrative and quite long form. So yeah, it's kind of a circuitous route.
Thanks, Maureen. Anyone else got a question before we close?
I'd just like to say that I've just finished reading Dervin Murphy's A Place Apart.
Yes.
And what you said resonates so much. I wondered if across the board you want such an ashamed to say, but it's uncanny that I finished that this morning, so I look forward to it.
Very good, thank you. There's someone down the back there, yeah?
I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed the poem where you talked on the phone to your father after he's died. And I think it's really interesting because I did it myself.
Right.
I used my husband's name after he died. And
Right.
I didn't know I was going to. And
Yes.
it was quite an odd thing because it was almost like somebody else did it.
Yes.
But I just thought it was a wonderful poem. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think that's the sign of a successful poem, when you have people who identify with the poem in that way. I think that's huge. Listen, that's all we've got time for, unfortunately, so I want to thank once again Maureen, Stephanie and Glen, and thank you everyone for coming on.